All right, and welcome everybody to the Back Again Sequel Podcast. As always, I'm Matt.
I'm Drew.
And this is our ranking episode. This season, we watched 12 comedy sequels to find out which ones were worth going back again. And today, we are going to rank these films from our least favorite to our favorite. As a whole, Drew, how'd you feel about the season?
That's not great.
I gotta be honest, it was kind of hard making my list because, one, I had forgot a lot about these sequels, or maybe I just blocked them out of my kind of memory. So going through it, because there were so many bad ones, it was kind of hard ranking the bad ones, and I had to justify in my mind why this bad sequel would go over this bad one. I don't know if you had similar issues.
Yeah, the same. My problem is my list doesn't start till 10 because the first two are just they're like negative.
Yeah. Well, there was one episode that you weren't necessarily a part of, but you did do your own research, which was Home Alone 2.
Yes. And I did, through my independent research, it was unfortunate because, spoiler alert, that seems like one of the better episodes.
Yeah.
Or one of the better sequels.
Well, before we jump into it, let's find a way to ease into the season and try to spark our memories a little bit with some Back Again Sequel Podcast Season 3 Fun Facts. So in general, yeah, like we said, it was a pretty rough season. As far as movies that were worth going back again, there are only 3 movies on this list. It was Addams Family Values, Wayne's World 2, and Ace Ventura When Nature Calls.
Okay, makes sense.
We had one movie joining the movie Limbo, which was Home Alone 2. And then, believe it or not, even though all these movies were pretty negative, there was only one movie that got all X's across the board, and that was Mean Girls 2. In general, as far as checks and X's we gave throughout the season, we gave a total of 24 checks between all 12 episodes and 51 X's. Just to kind of get into the budget and the box office of the season, the lowest budget that we dealt with all season was $11 million with Next Friday, and the highest budget at $60 million was Analyze That.
That's interesting. I guess because you have the 2 leads that need to come back.
And then as far as the box office goes, the lowest box office at $27.2 million was Airplane 2. And the highest box office at $359 million was Home Alone 2 Lost in New York.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a money-making franchise.
We obviously had some critiques on some of the sequels this season, but as far as the Rotten Tomatoes scores go for the lowest and the highest, let's start with the highest. Let's start with the positive and work our way to the negative. What do you think was the highest critical score as far as sequels that we did this season?
It's because I'm just going to my favorite one.
Yeah.
And they're my number one pick, and I don't think that's accurate.
Well, we'll do a critical and we'll do an audience score.
Yeah, I really couldn't say.
So the highest critical score of all the sequels we did this season at a 75% was Addams Family Values.
Okay. I can't believe that was the highest.
Yeah. And then as far as an audience score goes, at 76% was Next Friday.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. But I think that's also because a lot of people love the Friday verse, and they really like Mike Epps in that one.
Is it called the Friday verse?
I'm calling it the Friday verse. As far as the lowest Rotten Tomatoes scores go, what do you think was the lowest critical score?
I'm just going based off of other information. I want to say Airplane because it had the lowest box office return.
The lowest critical score, which is a movie we actually just did, was Miss Congeniality 2 Armed and Fabulous at 15%. And then the lowest audience score at 29% was Mean Girls 2. But to be fair, there's no critical score for Mean Girls 2.
Okay, I was going to say.
Yeah, but that was the lowest one out of all of it.
Well, I was going to say, there was probably no box office for Mean Girls 2 either. No. We should probably... Mean Girls 2 is like an anomaly because I think that was technically a made-for-TV movie.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll tell you is just as far as repeated actors that popped up on multiple sequels. There might be more, but the only ones that I really registered were William Shatner, as far as being in Airplane 2 and the Miss Congeniality verse.
He's a funny guy.
And then Regina King, as far as Legally Blonde 2 and Miss Congeniality 2. And, we're going to start our ranking here shortly. As I'm looking at my list, I might adjust some of my positioning last minute, just if something from our conversation sparks a memory that kind of leans more positive one way or whatever. But let's go ahead and jump into our ranking episode of season 3 of the Back Again Sequel Podcast, which was comedy sequels. Starting at number 12, I have a guess that we're both going to have the same answer for this, but maybe not. I'll just start it off. My number 12 is Mean Girls 2.
I was gonna say the bottom three for me was very difficult, and I have to go in, and it's easy to give Mean Girls the bottom slot because we gave it no checks. But when I went back and I was finding out why we were giving out checks to some of these sequels, I have to go back and say that Blues Brothers 2000
Wow.
is my number 12.
Okay.
Because the only reason we gave it a check was because it was so bad it made the sequel, or it made the original, look good by comparison.
Yeah, and then
so when you're that bad, Mean Girls 2 was bad, but it wasn't so bad that it made me want to go back and rewatch the first Mean Girls. Blues Brothers 2000 is that bad.
Yeah, it really is. And I kind of floated with that too. And the only reason why Mean Girls got the number 12 slot for me was because it's just not a sequel.
Yeah.
It's one of those things again where
it's a technicality kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's also barely a movie. Because it's a made-for-TV movie, so I kind of felt bad.
It's not even a good made-for-TV movie. It's like, oh God, it's so like pathetic.
Didn't we say on that episode that they shot it in like 20-something days?
They shot it less than that. They shot, I think it was like 17, because I actually remember rewatching that part specifically. It was ridiculous.
But yeah, that's my number 12, and so your number 12 is Blues Brothers 2000.
Well, it connects back to what I was saying kind of earlier, where it's like the first two slots don't even count because they're not even. Yeah. It's like this is like this one doesn't count for me because it's just so bad.
Well, then maybe this can open up the conversation a little bit, because then what's your number 11?
My number 11 is Legally Blonde 2, Red, White, and Blonde.
Wow. Okay, my number 11 is Blues Brothers 2000. That's what I was trying to have the conversation about. Before we go into Legally Blonde, let me just kind of capitalize on...
Let's go ahead and put a button on Blues Brothers so we don't have to talk about it again.
Because you just mentioned Blues Brothers in the 12th spot. Yeah. It is my number 11, mostly for a lot of the reasons that you just said. It is, in a lot of ways, like the most offensive sequel I think we've done on this list, because it is tarnishing the beauty and the innocence of that first Blues Brothers, and just kind of the perfect storm of everybody coming together to make that tonally, and then like literally digging a grave and burying it, and just having Dan Aykroyd dance on top of it. And the music's not good. I mean, the music's okay, but the performances and the context for why the music is happening is not good.
Yeah, it's like the physical performances are terrible.
And the plot is just ridiculous. There's like, I think we said in the episode, it's like Dan Aykroyd went to a cabin for the weekend, farted it out, and then the director was like, yeah, that's good enough. Let's just shoot this. But that's the reason why it's my number 11, because to me, that's where the list actually kind of starts. Yeah, because Mean Girls 2 is not a movie. Yeah. But Blues Brothers 2000 is the worst sequel, in my opinion. So Legally Blonde 2 is your 11.
My 11, yeah. Very quickly to just touch on it before we get to where it is on your list. For a lot of the similar reasons of Blues Brothers 2000s, where the sequel is so bad it makes the good one look better by comparison. That's kind of where I kind of place them around the same. That's why I place them both at the bottom, is because it's almost like a black hole where they're so bad they collapse upon themselves, and then they actually make something else look better by comparison. The only reason Legally Blonde is ahead is because it doesn't actually tarnish a reputation. Like, you know. Like, yeah, no one died, and then they didn't do the sequel after someone died.
It's still your 11, though.
Yeah. Because that is the worst reason, is because the biggest insult I can give is you are so bad you made something else look good by comparison. Yeah. It's like the worst thing I could say about anything.
All right, well, let's move on to number 10, and I will start off number 10, and I will say that mine is Miss Congeniality 2, Armed and Fabulous. The reason this is my number 10 is just, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying about like Legally Blonde and stuff, but at the end of the day, I do think that the first Miss Congeniality is such an open and shut like movie that to do a sequel to it, you would really have to take the character like into a new territory and push her outside of her comfort zone. And with this sequel, they kind of do that, but they also don't. And they bog it down with a plot that never really has stakes and comedy that frankly never really works. And then they kind of just shoe in that whole open mic drag club at the end just to get Sandra Bullock and Regina King dancing on stage. And since that movie was more fresh to me because we had just recently watched it, I was like, yeah, this is an unnecessary sequel as well. So that's my number 10.
It does seem very unnecessary. There did seem to be better ways you could do it. And I was also just like thinking about like what really sucked about that one was the messaging. The messaging was just all over the place.
My favorite thing is what you said is what I used for a clip is, what does Miss Congeniality stand for?
Yeah. No one knows.
So what's your number 10?
Mean Girls 2. That was at least interesting because it was a made for TV movie. So it was like you put it at the bottom on a technicality because it was an anomaly. I thought the anomaly elevated it a little bit.
Okay.
So I was just like, all right, it's better than like these actual ones that tarnish the original.
Well, so your positioning of that movie is kind of influenced outside of the way you view the sequels for this podcast. It's more about like strictly like your enjoyability. Yeah.
Because we do I keep all the technicalities with the rankings and the checks and the X's. So when we're doing I guess that was not ranking, with the categorization of the checks and the X's, when we're doing the rankings, I'm going more just based off of enjoyability. I'm completely fine with saying that I liked Mean Girls better than Blues Brothers 2000.
All right, well, let's move on to number 9. And what's your number 9?
Well, now I feel like we're kind of out of the bottom section. So now we can actually talk about mediocre movies instead of terrible movies. Mm-hmm. My number 9 was, I'll speak of the devil, Miss Congeniality.
Okay. My number 9 is Legally Blonde 2.
And maybe, okay, so we're still just stepping all over each other. Yeah.
So maybe what we can talk about is just like the slight differences as to why like Legally Blonde 2 was worse for you, and I put it kind of at a 9 for me. And the only difference I would say between like a Miss Congeniality 2 and a Legally Blonde 2 does come back to the lead performer. And I think I enjoyed Reese Witherspoon more than I enjoyed Sandra Bullock. And not to say anything about them personally as like performers, but Elle Woods, I think in general is easier to like digest than Gracie Hart, depending on the circumstance. Because like on paper, Legally Blonde 2, there was a good idea in there as far as like taking her to a bigger world, and she's going to get a bill made, and she's dealing with like Washington bureaucrats, and you have that contrast of her trying to be like nice with the people that are being shady. But I agree with everything you said, where it's like it was so bad that it made the first one like, well, the first one was good either way, but it made you appreciate the first one a lot more. But still, there were moments that were kind of like, I don't know if they were intentionally or unintentionally so ridiculous that they were kind of entertaining. Like that whole scene where the cheerleaders go to Washington and they put on that performance of bow wow wow yippee yo yippee yay, like the sorority sisters and stuff.
Yeah,
like there were actual jokes in Legally Blonde 2 that I actually laughed at, even if there were only a couple of them. Whereas in Miss Congeniality 2, there were like no jokes, and the only ones that were there came from side characters.
Yeah, well,
so that was my motivation as to why Legally Blonde 2 got the 9 spot for me.
I got the similar argument. I would just say I found Miss Congeniality 2 funnier.
Really?
Yeah. And I'll say I like I don't know if you were talking about performance or character, but I like the Gracie Hart character better. I think she's more interesting.
But that world is so limiting because she is a cop, and if you're not going to have her go undercover again, then what are you going to do with her?
Yeah, but the execution in Legally Blonde 2 is so bad as well. So it's like they all have their flaws. It's like you have to pick what you like most and how much you like it. So that's what I'm going based off of is, I think Miss Congeniality has a slightly better character and a slightly funnier sequel.
So in theory, our bottom four, 12 to 9, they were all kind of the same, just kind of rearranged. So now it might be a little bit more interesting as we get into our number 8 spot. And my number 8 is actually Sister Act 2.
Same.
Really? Okay, great.
This is so boring.
Now, everything that we just kind of said, the only reason why Sister Act 2 gets above like Miss Congeniality, because it's like the same plot that they're kind of retreading. We're going undercover, going into witness protection because of like a murder. And in general, I think I gave Sister Act 2 the 8th spot because at least there was music in it that was good. And overall, the plot was so ridiculous that we kind of had a really good time watching it, being like, why is she in the nun getup again?
Yeah, because you're actively questioning it instead of just like bored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a selfish kind of influence behind like me putting it here, just because like it was so bad that it was kind of good, but it also is like just like a completely unnecessary sequel.
Yeah.
But Whoopi Goldberg, a
lot of these are unnecessary.
Yeah, but you have Lauryn Hill, you got Jennifer Love Hewitt, you got
I forgot she was in that.
you have just so many questions as you're watching that movie as to like why are they doing this?
Why is anyone doing anything that they're doing?
Also, I thought a lot about the villains, how they kind of turn into cartoon characters.
I forgot about the bad guys. I forgot there were bad guys in that movie.
It's the priests.
You brought up a good point where it's so ridiculous it's a little bit more enjoyable to watch. I really didn't consider that.
Yeah.
I really only put it in the 8 spot because it does suffer from a lot of these other problems that the movies in this area suffer from. It just has a little bit of a better like messaging behind it.
Yeah, there was a cultural significance that the
Yeah.
movie brought that I
Which
think
I
was
don't like attributing to the rankings because I feel like it's extra, but when everything kind of blends together in the same kind of like 1 out of 6 checks,
Yeah.
it's like anything to stand out helps.
And I think it's okay to like kind of get the full story behind a project and like to put that kind of consideration in when you are like watching it or even like ranking it. And like I don't think that anybody made this movie with like bad intent. It just was bad.
Yeah.
Like
I love it because I remember it was like they need a teacher for these kids. So the nuns are like, remember that lounge singer who was in witness protection?
Yeah.
She should teach these children.
all right, so that's going to be our number 8. So let's move on to number 7. And what's your number 7 going to be?
Analyze that.
So is mine.
Oh,
Mine is
wow.
Analyze That. It barely beat Sister Act for me just because there were more jokes, I guess, that I laughed at, even though once again it's a sequel that is completely unnecessary. But just in regards to the conversations that they tried to have about therapy and, like I said, some of the jokes and the bits that they do, it was more enjoyable than a Sister Act 2. And it wasn't like, it wasn't one of those movies where we're saying, oh, is this over yet? It was pretty short. You got Billy Crystal and Robert De Niro that are really kind of carrying you through that movie just from their performance alone. But I mean, my God, what happened to Robert De Niro's wife and son? Like, there's so many issues with it. But for me, that's why it's kind of like right in the middle of the list.
The big thing that elevated it for me was the chemistry and I guess the star power between the two leads.
Yeah.
Because it's just like that. It's like I said before. It's like when you have nothing, when everything sucks. It's like you really just pick out like single things that really stand out to you, and it's like that dynamic works, even if for the sequel the script and everything else doesn't really. I don't think any of these sequels on the back half have actually been like justified. I think they've all been like, there's no reason for any of them to exist except for money.
All right, well, let's move on to number 6. It's kind of the last one in the mid tier. And why don't you go ahead and go first with this one?
My number 6 is Next Friday.
Okay, so I was literally about to do a switch before you said it, and I'm going to stick with it. And my number 6 is also going to be Next Friday as well. And the reason why it's just outside of the top 5 is because of the plot and because of the decision to make this movie take place 2 years after the original Friday. It's not Next Friday, it's 2 years after that original
It's 2
Friday.
years after Next Friday.
Yeah. But then with that being said, the reason why it's above these other ones is because of the performances of Mike Epps and the fact that there are actual funny scenes that happen in the movie.
Yeah.
Mike Epps really helped elevate this one up.
Yeah, and it's like fun.
Yeah.
You're not bored watching it.
The dad too. The dad was funny also.
All the characters are pretty funny. It's just they don't have any like real consistency or like weight to the plot.
Yeah.
It's just like a bunch of skits almost.
I love the fact in the episode when you're saying like, he moved to this new town to live with his uncle because the bad guy breaks out of prison, and then he immediately handles the bad guy, and then he just goes back home.
Yeah, it's like they drove him there with the intention of moving him there. Everything takes place over the course of a day, so by the end of the day he's leaving.
He was supposed to be there for like a long time.
My other favorite thing is that he was still unemployed 2 years later.
I know.
It's like, it's been 2 years. He can have a job. He can have some character development.
Mm-hmm. So then to go off of that, let's go into our top 5. And the reason I switched these at the last minute came down just to memory of watching it. But my number 5 is going to be Home Alone 2 Lost in New York.
Same.
Wow, okay. Yeah, Home Alone 2 for me gets in the top 5 because even though they kind of rush through the justification of how we're going to get in this situation again, there is an alarm clock that gets unplugged intentionally by the father that causes them to be late for the airport the next morning, versus in the first one, it's an actual storm power outage. And when you have the stupidity of your characters influencing why the plot's going to be the plot, like I hate that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, They did go bigger with the traps in the house. There is an elevation because they are in New York. And I don't know, there's just a lot, like Tim Curry's in it. I think that's another reason why it kind of got a push for me. So overall, it's elevated. There's funnier bits and stuff like that, but it also still suffers just from a ridiculous and unnecessary plot. But when you look at the other sequels on this list, it's like, all right, well, I got to put it somewhere. So at least I'll put it in my 5 spot.
Yeah, I was listening to a lot of what you were saying about it on the episode, you and Kaylee, and like I did some research at the end of the day too. And at the end of the day, it just seems like a very efficient, like competent sequel, where it's just like it feels like the kind of sequel all of these movies should be, where it's just like people have enough of an idea of what they're doing and what they should be doing, and they're getting it done, and they're getting it done in a very short amount of time too, based on what you said.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous circumstantially how crucial elements to the plot come into play. One was the alarm clock. The second is why the wet bandits are in New York. Like Marv and Harry,
Is that never like even mentioned in one line?
they just show up on they escape prison, and then they hide in a fish truck, and that fish truck happens to land in New York at the same time when Kevin McAllister's walking by.
So yeah, it's just a bunch of coincidences and stupid characters making the plot happen.
They literally pass him on the street, and Joe Pesci's like, I think that guy looks familiar. And it's like the dumbest thing in the world. But then they do elevate the plot in the second half when Kevin is trying to stop the bandits from stealing from a toy store where the money and the donations are going to go to sick kids in the hospital.
Yeah.
So he's got more of a motivation to do the right thing. It's just that the villains, like, I kind of would have liked to see him face off against new villains, you know?
Yeah, like increase the stakes.
Yeah, but I think they do that in the Home Alone sequels, and all those movies are really bad.
I don't think they're bad for that reason.
All right, so that's going to be our number 5. So we've been batting 1,000 for the last 4 rankings. So let's move on to number 4. And my number 4 is going to be Airplane 2.
Same.
Wow. I think the only reason why this is my number 4 was just
this is when they actually start getting good and funny. It's like this are the only movies worth watching.
Well, Airplane franchise in general is weird because these aren't technically movies. These are parody movies. Kind of like
more like a skit show because it's
exactly.
like, yeah, it just
there's
uses
more
the
gags
references.
and sketches across the board. And, you know, Airplane 2 was not as funny as the first Airplane, but there were bits that were funny. And it was also just a weird, kind of interesting movie with the fact that they set this like in space, but didn't really fully kind of commit to that. They went to space just so they could do some space movie references with like Hal from 2001 and everything. It was nice that the characters returned, even though they really just kind of completely reset them to where I don't even remember the people's names, but like the lead guy, he's in a mental facility again because something off screen happened.
I couldn't keep track of the plot for Airplane 2 because I don't know if they did it on purpose, but it was like they kept retconning stuff.
Yeah.
And like there were all these flashbacks.
At least like, you know, some of the people that they brought in that were new, like William Shatner, were really funny. One of my favorite jokes was like when they tell William Shatner, we got the guy's record, but you're not going to like it. And it's like his polka record.
Oh, yeah. I just love that when they introduce him and he steps out of the machine when you think it's a broadcast.
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, it was funny, but still, it's just slim pickings as to why this kind of gives above, why this is ranked above
in any other
ones.
ranking. It wouldn't be a 4.
No. But I think we did, unfortunately, pick a lot of stinkers this season. So that's why it's going to be number 4. All right, so let's move on to number 3, and you can go ahead and start off this one. Let's see if we keep batting 1,000.
My number 3 was Ace Ventura.
So was mine. Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls.
Jesus Christ.
These top 3 are probably all funny and enjoyable. It just comes down to preference. And for me, Ace Ventura was one of the funnier ones, but you know, Jim Carrey's just like super annoying in those movies.
Not as bad as the first one. The first one, he is just annoying and off-putting. And in the sequel, he is annoying and off-putting, but it's more digestible.
I'm saying that compared to the other sequels that I've ranked higher, as far as what are like my number 2 and my number 1 comedies are, this comes in at number 3 because Jim Carrey was more annoying than the other characters in these other sequels. I mean, it's the freshest in my mind because that's what we finished the season on, and it was funny, and the plot is kind of like whatever.
Yeah, fuck the plot.
You know,
who cares?
It's kind of a soft reboot in a lot of ways.
it kind of seemed like the pilot episode for a TV show where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
you saw him in the movie, now here's what he actually does, and he goes around the world like the crocodile hunter or whatever.
I actually think you could have done. I actually thought of this after we watched it, that you could have done a really good combination of 1 and 2 to make a movie where he starts in America as just a pet detective,
Yeah.
but he's a joke, and then he's given an opportunity to solve a bigger case
Or
in
he's just
Africa.
like really small scale.
Exactly, but he decides to go to Africa to take on this bigger challenge to kind of prove his worth. So yeah, overall, Ace Ventura is number 3 for us, but for a lot of reasons, mostly because all these other comedies were pretty bad. I think we're gonna bat 1,000
I think so,
for the
yeah.
rest of this. I think from 8 to 1, and keep in mind we haven't seen each other's lists, but I think we're gonna be pretty accurate for the rest of it. So let's go ahead and jump on to number 2, and my number 2 is gonna be Wayne's World 2.
Same.
Okay. And just to kind of go off of what we just said, there actually are a lot of elements that I like about the first Wayne's World. I don't know if I would say Wayne's World 2 is better than the first Wayne's World,
I would say that.
but I do think that it is directed a little better, and there are more comedy moments, and in general the plot is interesting, but I do prefer more smaller kind of plots. And I like that. I like the plot of the first Wayne's World, where it's just them breaking onto like a more national cable kind of level.
I could see that. For comedy specifically, I kind of like the bigger plots because if they can use it for a joke, then yeah. And I feel like they do for Wayne's World.
Well,
For Wayne's World 2.
not to go too much into the plot, but I remember there's something really dumb and lazy about the way that they kind of solve everything in Wayne's World 2, which is, he's got to put on a big concert. He can't book the bands. And then out of nowhere, the bands just show up for the concert.
No, the whole thing is like only one band shows up.
That's right. Aerosmith shows
and,
up.
and they consider it a win. And you kept getting hung up on that because you were like, that's not a fulfilling ending.
Yeah, which is the ending of the first Wayne's World I felt was a lot stronger, because not only do they actually have a regular ending, but then they do the joke of multiple endings. Yeah. They do the joke of multiple endings in the second one too, but when they actually get to that like happy ending, it's like
it
you
felt
just
like
said,
a joke too.
Yeah, it's like, wait, you only got Aerosmith, you didn't get everybody else.
Which is like a hat on a hat, because like if you had ended it like that and it was just like, oh, they only got the one band, but it's a happy ending, you'd be like, oh, haha, that's a joke, because it's just they're just wrapping it up. But they do the multiple endings, and then they do the ending where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So I definitely think that there are elements to Wayne's World 1 that were better. Also, as far as Wayne's World 2 goes, Christopher Walken, I think I liked more than Rob Lowe, even though Rob Lowe's not bad in the first one either.
That would maybe
they're essentially the same villain.
Yeah, I just like Christopher Walken better. I can't say I like his performance better.
It's just so ridiculous because in the first one, Wayne's afraid that his girlfriend is going to go with Rob Lowe, but it never really happens. If anything, Wayne's insecurity and jealousy kind of pushes her towards him more. In the second one, she marries Christopher Walken, or tries to marry Christopher Walken, and he's got to go stop the wedding. And it kind of just goes back to a lot of similarities with these comedy sequels, whereas in the female leads are useless. They do not know how to write characters for these female leads, and they're often just kind of like doing whatever the plot needs them to do.
Well, it's unfortunate because Wayne's World is a bad example, but like sometimes the original movies can do it well. Because I'm just thinking of like Miss Congeniality, but like in the sequel, they almost always suck.
Well, let me kind of repurpose what I'm trying to say. When there is a comedy movie that involves a man-child,
oh yeah,
and a love interest in regards to the man-child, the love interest is barely there. And then when you have a character like Billy Crystal and Analyze This and Analyze That, who's not a man-child, but his wife Lisa Kudrow has nothing to do in those movies besides, I want to get married, and now I'm married.
Yeah. Now what?
Yeah. So in general, Wayne's World 2 was funnier, I think, than like Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. But once again, it's really just because of Dana Carvey and Mike Myers and some of the side characters. So with that being said, we've batted 1,000 from 8 to 1, and our number 1 is gonna be Addams Family Values.
Yep. Which isn't even a sequel.
Once again, it's like a soft reboot, kind of the same way Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. But
we the thing is, like, we got duped this season because, like, how many did we do that are actually, like, we probably only actually did like 6 real sequels. The other 6 were just like soft reboots or something else.
In theory, we kind of pick some of these ones because we think that they're going to be more interesting to talk about than just like the good sequels. But when you actually watch them, you find out like, oh, I don't want to talk about this like at all.
Some of them.
Some of them.
Adam's Family definitely was one worth watching and talking about.
And Adam's Family Values is a really interesting movie to be number 1 on this ranking list because, like we just said, it is like a soft reboot. It is kind of episodic. I believe that we actually both gave it X's when it came to does this work as a sequel.
Yeah.
But it does need to exist, and it is enjoyable / entertaining. And some of the best jokes in the franchise are in this movie, besides maybe the play from the first Addams Family where the kids are like fencing and then they're cutting each other's arms off on stage and blood is spurting everywhere. But the ensemble cast is great. The villain's great. The plot is
the same as the first one.
And also I would say kind of worse on paper because you have the family like separated and you have these kind of 3 storylines that don't really gel.
You're right, because that is like a sitcom where you have like the A, B, and C arcs, but like I think it works with that kind of family dynamic. It might not be the best. You only really get one good Addams Family movie, so it's probably not the best vehicle for the one good movie you're gonna get. But it works for that family dynamic.
Well, instead of saying it works, I would say that they kind of overcompensate with the fact that they have a weak plot by then doing as many jokes and gags as possible.
But they're good at it.
But that's what I'm saying. So then they're good at it. So it's like you kind of don't mind the fact that the plot is a retreading of mostly centering around Fester, but it's got like just really funny moments and funny performances across the board. But yeah, it's weird to say that that's our best comedy sequel because in some ways it's not a sequel. The number 12 for me isn't a sequel, and the number 1 for me isn't really a sequel. This was obvious for me from the start that Addams Family Values was going to be number 1 because
it wasn't obvious for me.
Really?
I had to do my list first, yeah.
Well, even though we watched it almost like 2 years ago, it's still stuck with me as far as some of the one-liners that they do because there's so many really funny one-liners.
Well, I was looking at, when I was doing my list, I was keeping track of how many checks we would give these sequels, and we gave Wayne's World 2 5 checks.
Yeah.
And when we only gave Addams Family 4. So technically, on paper, Wayne's World would be at the top because it got the most checks.
Yeah, I do remember kind of begrudgingly, like, I don't think I gave it a check for does it work as a sequel.
Yeah, I forget what the 1 check or the 1 X was.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
In general, I think Addams Family Values is the most memorable of this list.
Yeah.
Just because of the fact that that family, at least in the sequel, is represented in a way that's very, like, easy to digest.
Yeah.
Even though to this day, I asked this question on that episode and I still haven't had it answered. What is the Addams Family? What do they do? Are they connected to the dead? Like in 2 movies, I never understood what the shtick of the Addams Family was.
Like why they are that way.
How do they have money? Why are they like? Why can they not die? Are they from out of time? Like I was just so confused. But at the end of the day, it's the information is given to you in such a fun way that you don't really give a shit.
Like in the background.
But I asked the people, what is the Addams Family?
Well, do you remember back in the day when they would do the Scooby-Doo show and they would have like the guest episodes and it would be Scooby-Doo meets the Addams Family?
Oh, is there one of those?
There's a couple of those, yeah. They should do a live action reboot of that.
Well, does the Scooby Game figure out what the Addams Family is?
No, but there might be some like lore cuts in there. Okay. I know those episodes are lost. Like you can't they're not like around anymore.
All right. Well, that is going to be our ranking from 12 to 1. Obviously, we batted 1,000 from 8 to 1. But what do you think? Do you agree with us? Do you disagree with us? Come up with your own ranking and put it in the comments below. Big thanks to everybody, again, who listened to this season of the Back Again Sequel podcast. If you like this episode, make sure you like, subscribe, and you comment below. You can listen to all episodes of the Back Again Sequel podcast, available wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can watch these episodes with video on YouTube. Just subscribe to @wag.productions. And in regards to season 4 of what sequels we're going to do next, because the beauty about all these seasons is that we can always revisit a genre and find 12 more sequels that we haven't done yet. But as we continue to kind of truck along, we'll pick a new genre and we will pick 12 sequels from that genre and do it next. So stay tuned to find out which season we are going to be diving into next. Make sure you also follow us on all social media. We are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. And outside of that, you got anything else to add, Drew?
We are so glad you came. Bye-bye. 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 Bye-bye now. Bye. Bye-bye.
All right, we will see you next time.
Bye, 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 bye again. Bye, 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 bye again. I'm back again.